Hello, beautiful community. Let's do a little workshop together about populism and democracy by kicking off with this Trump quote. Quote begins, and dear YouTube, quote begins. This is not me speaking. There's a challenge content creators have at the moment whereby them presenting certain things isn't distinguished from them asserting these things. Not that asserting these things should be necessarily something we need to remove either, but that distinction is very important. I know a lot of creators at the moment who've got real issues at that distinction not being applied. Just the other day, a friend of the channel was quoting Russell Brand and seems to have got into trouble as though he was saying this from his own vantage point, whereas in fact he was making a video essay about exploitative content online. Even Vladimir Putin says that Biden's, this is Trump quote, politically motivated persecution of his political rival is very good for Russia because it shows the rottenness of the American political system, which cannot pretend to teach others about democracy. Now, from me, if you were gathering here for a packet of fries from McDonald's, what you'd want from me is Putin is a tyrant. Trump's a Russian asset for saying that. And he's a terrible threat to our democracy. And he's evil. That's what would be the sort of McDonald's fries versions. But I want to cook you some homemade potatoes. And not sell them to you, but give them to you today. We're going to try that. Health allowing, I'll remain coherent throughout this brief conversation. But we're going to try this homemade potatoes route. Now, I wrote a very short tweet about this. This conversation won't be based on a Twitter thread. It'll be direct between us and spontaneous. But I'll just read that tweet because we'll come back to it right at the end, because I know some of you will want my comment on the sort of issue that the tweet raises. Trump and Putin are often listed together, I say. I don't like this. Putin is an external force. Trump isn't. Trump is a domestic disease. To beat Putin, we look out of the window. To beat Trump, we look in the mirror. That, of course, is a public intellectual exaggeration made to make a certain intervention. We'll come back to it. We'll come back to this business of what kind of threat the Russians pose to us versus what kind of threat domestic populism that the Russians are trying to encourage presents us with. But we will emphasize throughout this conversation the idea that there are good and bad kinds of populism. So, let's do scary emotions first. One of the scariest things is that you look at the future in your society, and because things are going downhill and falling apart, you don't feel confident you can see that future, or you can see it in a way that is reassuring or compelling or hopeful. And that is really, really, really scary. And then there is a social component to this, which is that when citizens fail to share some picture of the future together, this is all citizens in a society, citizens who disagree, it can get very, very, very scary. And let's be honest, if you're an American citizen, you're watching this, the chances are 98% that you don't like Trump. What picture of the future do you share with Trump voters? What is it that they want that you want? And the fact that for many of you this answer will feel difficult to give, except by saying something terribly generic and vague, well, that's scary. The first bit is emotionally scary, you can't see the future. The second bit is emotionally and politically scary because societies don't work without some joint picture of the future together. How do we begin to get into this? What do we begin to say about what you, let's say you have a very different political outlook to Trump, but what can you say that you share in common with Trump voters that they're also going to recognize as indeed a thing that they share with you? What could you say? I think one thing you could say is that you want to bring it about, and this is true of any country, but we're just picking on the United States today. You want to bring it about that every citizen can touch politics, can look at politics and not feel completely alienated, like it's something that they can't understand or they can't do anything about. You don't want citizens to feel like that. You want citizens to feel that politics is working for them, that it's something that they can touch. It's something that makes sense to them when they get near it. That's just one thing you can say in this very important direction. What do you all share in common? It's absolutely vital. Now, let's talk a little bit about varieties of populism, and there are several. The varieties of populism are not analytically discernible things. They're not things you sit in an ivory tower and produce in virtue of analytical differentiation. It's about what's actually going on in the world. What kind of movements are there? What kind of shape do they have? There's one kind of populist that's very clearly visible to us. That's somebody who wants to break the system. That's to say, they don't just want to get away with it or hold power. They specifically are set on breaking the system. In other words, they're welcoming opportunities, if those come for them, to break the democratic game. That's their goal. There is a second type of populist, quite different, and that is the political entrepreneur or the surfer of political currents or currents of public opinion or currents of trends on social media. And here the entrepreneur isn't out to break the system. They are just surfing. But if they surf in such a way that the system gets broken, so be it. If they surf in such a way that the system doesn't get broken, so be it. So they're not trying to break the system, but they're nowhere near having a responsible attitude to the sacredness of democratic institutions. Right? That's a very important category. We always struggle with in-betweenness. I mean, we talked about this in the context of the Middle East, right? The in-betweenness between trying to, for example, deliberately go for civilians and trying to positively avoid hurting civilians. Well, there's an ocean in between, right? And so here too, we've got to make these distinctions. So the second category of populist is somebody who is a surfer, an entrepreneur. There is then a third kind of populist, and that is what I call an institutional populist. That's a populist who is actually committed to keeping the democratic game going. They are a sort of selective populist. They do populist messaging here and there on important issues, but they try to, even though there is no way of drawing a sharp line here, they try to, on the whole, not be seen by their citizens as saying that the democratic institutions we have are rotten and irredeemable and the hell with them. There is then a fourth kind of populist, and that's an institutional and inclusive populist. You see, you can be an institutional populist, but be an exclusionary populist. You can say, well, we're keeping our democratic institutions, but I don't care about all the population. I care about this 50% of it or this 80% of it, but not everybody is included. I'm going to exclude some groups on the basis of various characteristics, right? So you can be a populist who is both institutional and inclusive. Now, being an inclusive and institutional populist doesn't make you good or right or healthy, but it means that if you are going to be a populist, you do need to have these two ingredients if you are going to be a constructive populist. Now, what are the features of populism that help us identify it? Let's talk about this briefly, because there are two main ones. One is a substantive feature and one is a procedural feature of populism, how you really recognize whether somebody's a populist or not. The procedural feature of populism is that political discourse becomes table talk. So public discourse becomes increasingly equivalent to domestic expressions of private sentiment, right? And in different societies, public discourse and the expression of private sentiment can be in different relationships. I mean, in the country that I grew up in as a young child in the Soviet Union, public public discourse was trying to eat up private sentiment. In other words, the pattern in the Soviet Union was not that politics was going to sound increasingly like table talk, but that politics was trying to make table talk sound like politics, right? Western political deformations today of a populist kind, even though we recognize that not all populism is bad, go the other way. They create a situation where public discourse increasingly begins to sound like private sentiment expressed at the kitchen table, and not even in a very sophisticated way. So that's one very key procedural feature of populism. And there is one very key substantive feature of populism. That's the second bit we've got to look at. And that is the reactivation of questions that seemed before to be closed. In other words, if you are in 1998 or in 2008, the circle of issues that seem to be up for grabs and questions that seem to be up for raising was here. Populism substantively says, no, we've got to reactualize, repoliticize more questions than that. If citizens are worried about them, we're going to activate and sort of reactualize these questions. And so that's, of course, something you already very well understand, because you intuitively sense that the outbreak of populism is a lot of citizens, partly is a lot of citizens feeling, well, why are we treating certain questions? Why is the quote-unquote establishment, and we don't want to use such language actually because it obstructs thought, but why does quote-unquote the political establishment regard certain questions as settled when they're up for grabs? And I'd like to debate them, to be honest. Why is the quote-unquote establishment trying to treat certain things as rights that I actually think we should have a debate about first? And then populists come out and they raise this question, and then this the political environment that is committed to this narrow circle gets outraged. Well, how dare you float so far out and then reactualize topics? I'll give examples momentarily. And then there is a set of other features, substantive features that populism has that we can list, but one very central one is nationalism. And that means casting issues in terms of nationalism we previously wouldn't have thought of necessarily in terms of nationalism. So let's throw about some examples to see if that orientates us a bit better in what we've put on the table so far. But maybe before, let's say this. I think that a certain degree of populism is now inevitably part of doing politics successfully. And this creates a problem because it immediately means that you've got to be the inclusive institutional populist. And that's hard. Populism in of itself has a tendency of drifting you from being inclusive and institutional. But it's possible. And we have to try because populism is inevitable anyway. And a modicum of populism is always going to float near being a prerequisite for electoral success in Western countries for the foreseeable future. And I mean here not years, but decades. Let's take an issue from British politics to illustrate one of the points we've made. A populist trend that you can tap into, whether you're in the center, on the left, on the right, in the up and the down, however we think, or even fail to think of the ideological spectrum if we feel it's no longer as coherent as it used to be. But wherever you are, there is populist leverage in questioning what used to be called austerity politics in the UK. And how do you question it? Well, you question it by pointing out that it seemed like a certain view of the state was settled, but then it turned out that it wasn't. That's to say, the state was conceived as being a facilitator of the market. But now we have many citizens feeling that good questions need to be asked about whether that's so. And one of the strange things today in Britain is how many lifelong conservative voters would, for instance, be sympathetically disposed to a policy like the complete renationalization of public transport, or at least of rail. So what a populist politician could come out and do is say, they took it from you. They, being practitioners of austerity politics, it being certain functions of the state that are much richer than just being a facilitator of the market, that are necessary to actually meet the needs of citizens. They took it from you. So you could do this move in an exploitative way, but in principle, that kind of move is compatible with not being exploitative. But what I would say, however, is that that language, they took it from you, is in itself dangerous. It in itself risks putting into question the viability of the sustenance of our institutions But I'm also at the same time saying that some degree of such questioning is inevitable. So this is this very thin, eye of a needle through which we need to thread a successful political candidate in the West in the 2020s and the 2030s. Let's just throw about some more hypothetical examples of populist discourse. Let's say a politician in the United States comes along and says, I've got you all. I've got you folks who vote for Trump but have given up on public institutions. And I've got you folks who seem to vote for candidates who are accused of replicating an out-of-touch establishment. And I've got you others too. I've got you all. Let's say Bernie Sanders says that. Now let's say that an opponent of Bernie Sanders comes along and says, Bernie's I've got you all is snake oil. Why is it snake oil? It's snake oil because as soon as we begin to describe Bernie's project, it's going to become apparent that it's completely unrealizable if he were to become president, let's say in 2016. He wouldn't be able to do the overwhelming preponderance of what he claimed might be doable. And then Bernie can respond to that and say, no, this is nonsense. Then you can respond to him and say, that's nonsense. The details don't matter here. The politics doesn't matter. What matters is that we've just given a few examples of populist talk that could conceivably be constructive, actually, but could also be completely destructive and exploitative, right? But neither of the two things we've said, the pro-Bernie and the anti-Bernie thing, have to be anti-institutional or exclusionary. Both the things we've said, the I've got you all and the I've got you all is snake oil, they're both compatible with being inclusive and pro-institutional statements. So one way to think about this is that you've got to find all the politicians you can find who are institutional populists, maybe inclusive too, but at least institutional. And you've got to see what the kind of politics that you want can borrow from them, even if you don't, if you don't want them. So let's say that you are left wing. Look at some institutional right wing populists. This is hard because most right-wing populists today are anti-institutional. But if you can't find any in your country, look for some in other countries. And then see, can I imagine my own political candidates that I would support borrowing some populist techniques from them? It might, for example, be that they borrow some techniques around nationalism, right? Could I... let us say if I care very desperately about, well, let's actually take an example that's genuinely my own. Right? I take the climate crisis very, very, very seriously as an existential threat to democracy, among other things. And I have various kinds of ideas about how we can talk about the climate crisis in a populist way using nationalism. So, for instance, we might say that we've got to act urgently for future generations. And whatever country you're in, you might say future Germans, future Brits, putting future Brits first. all of us, not just some of us. And all of us includes our kids and grandkids. Britain first. And so, as cheap and dodgy as that might sound to you, it's inevitable that that politicians have to use this now. Otherwise, tendentiously, they're just going to lose. But you've got to use it in a responsible way. So this is very, very difficult. These are the kind of difficult waters that we are in. Now, did we want to say something else today before we get to the Putin point? No, that's enough. Let's do Putin now. So my quote was from Twitter, Trump and Putin are often listed together. I don't like this because Putin is an external force and Trump isn't. Of course, in many respects, that's not true. But the point is to emphasize one important point with a caricatural exaggeration like that. Putin is an external force. Trump isn't. Trump is a domestic disease. To beat Putin, got to look out of the window. To beat Trump, got to look in the mirror. So now, the problem we've got here is that we've got to recognize the intentionality, but also the actuality of Russian interference in our democracies. But we've got to do that, and the answer is yes and yes to both. It is intended and it is actual. Right? There's a politics of destabilization of Western democracies, and it was there long before the full scale of invasion of Ukraine. Right, since 2014, Russia had a politics of the destabilization of democracies involved in the back then rather minimal sanctions regime against Russia. But the risk of saying politician X is a Russian asset is very, very vast. Because what it does is externalize everything we've just talked about. As though once we eliminate some foreign threat, we don't need to think hard about anything we've just tried to think hard about in this little micro workshop. And the risk here is to simply externalize. Well, how far are you going to externalize? Right? If 2% of your population are saying things that you don't like, that are in small parts stoked by some malign foreign power, you're going to call them foreign agents? Okay. What about if 30% of your population do that? Right? So you've got to take seriously the organicity and domestic roots of what's happening. Without denying the Russian interference, but putting it in proportion. You don't want to make 2% 20%. You don't want to make 2% 80%. And the way to think about this is to recognize that certain deformations taking place in the Western world are of a piece and a part of a pattern, right? Trump is part of a West-wide decline in democracy. That means a series of factors, which we'll talk about separately. We have already talked about them, which in turn cause loss of trust. Different pathologies of loss of trust triggered by different pathologies of political untethering, right? The political untethering of societies. One of the easiest things to do, because it's so difficult to bear admitting that this is overwhelmingly a domestic product, is to externalize, and that's very dangerous. And the best antidote to externalizing is to recognize that you're not alone, right? That Trump is preponderantly not an American phenomenon. Trump's as American as, apple pie, as is as is Bernie Sanders, right? I mean, we're just saying that all kinds of things are domestically produced. But if you recognize that Brexit and Trump are part of the same story, that the rise of exclusionary right populism in Europe is part of the same story, and that this story is just at the beginning. So this wave is not anywhere near its peak. We're in the first 20% of this deterioration, right? Trump's an early kind of version of it. That should help us see that this is domestically produced. Paradoxically, the fact that whatever domestically means for you, you're not alone. There's other neighboring countries, ally countries, where the same stuff is happening. But that shows that it's domestically produced rather than just something artificial triggered by the Kremlin. So recognize Kremlin interference as real, but see it for what it is, not more. Now, at the moment, it's also possible to see that the type of populists we're getting are very much early models. The type of constructive populists we're getting, which is almost zero, but we're going to see more and more of those too, are early models. And the destructive populists are also early models. Let me say something about later models too. One feature of populism that's not universal, but it's common, is that these folks are buffoons. And that means that they are good at getting elected, but they are very limited when it comes to governance. And a feature of the future of populism in the West is that we're going to get populists who are disciplined and hard-nosed in that next wave. So the wave of Trump-style populists isn't going to be followed by non-populists. It's going to be followed by populists who are as destructive, but are also much more damaging once they're in office, right? So we're going to get Orbans, not Trumps. Orban can govern, right? He's a decision maker. He's got clarity of vision. He has got tremendous discipline. He's got tremendous message discipline. And he's not going to be sort of eaten up by 3 or 4 people he talks to regularly. He's going to have his own vision. And he's going to apply it consistently. And he can also have in mind projects that he thinks can't be done and wait years and then do them. And, you know, Johnson and Trump, for example, are folks who cannot govern, which has a positive implication that they cannot govern in their own favor either, beyond being able to do a certain number of things, but they have no governance discipline. So that's one type of future trend that's inevitable. The second type of future trend is a little bit more positive, is that I do think we're going to see increasingly institutional populists. I think that at the moment we've got a situation where we've got non-populists, we have got entrepreneurs who don't want to break the system but don't mind breaking it either, and then we've got the destructive populists who want to break the system. We've got sort of old school politicians who aren't populists and are pro-institutional. We've got entrepreneurs who don't care about the institutions, and we've got institution breakers. I think this is going to change. I think that the third category here, the institution breakers, are going to get more competent. The first category, the non-populists, are going to little by little begin disappearing. The entrepreneurs will stay but diminish in quantity, because at the moment we've got just entrepreneur after entrepreneur after entrepreneur coming along wherever you look. But they'll diminish, and we'll have a little bit coming to the fore of more destructive and more disciplined populists and more benign populists who are committed to institutions. So these are two predictions I'm making. Unfortunately, I do think that the destructive populists will dominate institutional populists. But none of this is written in stone. To a great extent, it's up to us. So I don't think this sort of helped you solve anything properly or get to anywhere properly, but it began to just throw very sort of partial rays of illumination. And as ever, the real value here is that we're continuing this conversation, and I want to be talking to you on and on and on and on. It's this ritual of re-engagement, I think, that helps us get places, even if in any single conversation we've just thrown a little bit of light here and there, and 97.2% of the landscape still remains in darkness. Lots of love. Talk soon.